So glandular epithelium, think of glandular as, the gland is produced from, again, invaginations of the epithelium. And these will form gland. And the prefix for gland is oftentimes people do say adeno. Okay. When you see the prefix adeno, it means glandular. Adeno. As in adenocarcinoma is a type of cancer that is from the gland. And of course we mentioned the difference between exocrines and endocrine, and that endocrine gland that secrete hormones into the blood is considered ductless, whereas exocrine secretes something into the duct. In fact, you know what, a good gland that sort of like important to know is the pancreas, if you will. Okay. Now the pancreas is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So if you say that, let's say here's the stomach, it looks something like this, and then the duodenum, which is the first portions of the small intestine. So nested in here is the pancreas. Okay. And the pancreas the pancreas has a major duct right here. And it secretes enzymes into this duct that empty into the small intestine. Okay. And since it secretes into the duct, it is an exocrine gland. Right. But it also has the islets of Langerhans that produces insulin, which is to regulate your blood glucose level. And insulin is in the blood, so that is part of the endocrine gland. So it's both exocrine and endocrine. Cesar, do you have a question? Cesar, do you have a question or no? All right, just lower your hand if you don't have a question. Moving on, this is also very important to know, okay? The difference between the gland and what kind of secretion. If it's more liquidy, like water, liquid, this is known as the American gland. Cesar, do you have a question? If you don't have a question, I'm just going to ignore your raising your hand. Okay, so this is more watery, if you will. It's known as the American gland. And the American gland, a good example is the sweat gland. Apocrine gland is a type of secretion, or apocrine secretion, or apocrine gland would make the secretion would have a part of the cell, okay? Pieces of the cells. Okay? That's known as the apocrine. And a good example of the apocrine is the mammary gland. Mm-hmm. It's the mammary gland. Now, a holocrine is a type of gland that secrete. In that secretion, there's a lot of cells. So, in other words, the whole cell come off as part of the secretion. And a good example of that is the sebaceous gland. Okay? And these are the glands that you often see associate with the integument system as well. So there you go. Uh, we don't have really to cover the integument system because it's discovered here, shown here. Holocrine gland, like sebaceous gland, which is really secretes sebum, and sebum is, this substance that is used to wet the hair. It's kind of like, you think of it as like conditioner, it makes your hair nice and smooth. Sebum. Okay. And you can see here the different types of gland and secretion. If it's a little liquid, it's merocrine. If it has piece of the cell, it's apocrine. Here are the whole cells that come off. This is holocrine. And here's sebaceous gland secretes sebum into the hair follicle, if you will. Okay. Again, show you the same thing. Merocrine, good example. Circle this wet gland. Apocrine, good example. Mammary gland. Ceruminous gland is also known as your earwax. Okay. Holocrine, sebaceous gland. The whole cell. So circle that. So know the type of secretion and the where you might find that. Okay. And that could be a statement in your review sheet, for example. Okay. Endocrine versus exocrine. Now, a lot of times the endocrine that secretes substance into the blood is known as ductless, right? The exocrine are a thing that's gland that secretes into the duct. In that case, it's multicellular, mini cell. But there is a type of gland that, well, I don't know if you call it a gland. Well, they generally call it the unicellular, one gland. And that unicellular gland secrete a substance, and that is a goblet cell. Okay? And the goblet cell often finds in the respiratory tract or the GI tract, typically the small intestine. And they look like a wine glass, like this. Right? Yeah, like that. So that's why they had this name, which is goblet. And they secrete mucin. Mucin plus water, it becomes mucus. And so goblet cells secrete mucus, as you can say, mucus. Okay, goblet cell. Okay, moving on. Multicellular as opposed to unicellular. I don't think we need to go into detail and say, if the type of gland that is just cells that form down a tube, we call it tubular. If it flat out, it's known as alveolar. Let's say here's alveolar, acinar, or multiple alveolar called branch, simple coil, or simple branch tubular. I'm not going to, talk about that. I mean, there's different kind, but other than that, you won't be tested. I would focus more on things like merocrine secretion, watery substance, apocrine, like the mammary gland, part of the cell that comes off, and holocrine, which is the whole cell come off, like the sebaceous gland. I think that's very good. That's all you need to know. And you don't need to know all these, whether it's compounded or not, and so forth, and as far as gland is concerned. All right, so that's pretty much finished with the epithelium, and we're going to talk about now connective tissue. Connective tissue is a broad group. Okay, it's very broad, and it has many function. Yeah, that was a lot already, just epithelium. But like I said, you have 3 hours in the lab. See, this study is part of the lab as well. Um, and in fact, you can say we cover, 30% of the histology. 40% is going to be on this thing. Connective tissue is broad, and I'm going to help you going through them. And another 30% between muscle. Muscle is not really that much, and nervous tissue really not that much. And we can say that in the when we talk about the nervous system. Connective tissues, as you can see here, has many functions, fill in the space, stores fat, produces blood cells. And like I said before, think of connective tissue, the cells do not stick together very far apart, but they produce this matrix, right? The matrix sometimes is highly organized like this, so you can call this as compact, okay? Compact. Or if it's not compact, it would be like this, it would be loose. That's it, okay? They have a matrix right here, and there varies degree. If it's very compact, varies degree of blood supply. If it's compact like this, then they usually consider it avascular. And a good example of this compact, I would say tendon and ligament. Remember I talked about tendon is between muscles and bone, and ligament is between bone and bone. And think of it, if you twist your ankle, for example, it takes a long time to heal because there's no blood supplies to it. So in this case, if they're highly organized structure, they're avascular. And then like the dermis is, which is under the skin, right? Again, this is an integument system. The skin has, you can say 3 layers, if you will. Okay, the layer that you saw of 4 or 5 layers of cells, which I expect you to know, and you remember them as come on, let's get some breakfast. Stratum, corneum, and so forth. This is known as the epithelium, right? Layer stratified, but the skin, it will form one layer of skin is known as the epidermis. Epidermis. And the epidermis is avascular. Avascular means no blood at all. Avascular. And underneath, the word epi means above. So there's a layer that is underneath this. Okay. So that's your dermis. The dermis layer, and then above that is epidermis. And the key here is that they form sort of like corrugated connection, like digit like this. Okay. So this makes like corrugated, boxes like this. It doesn't, if you don't have it, then it's possible that the epidermis can slide off the dermis. But having corrugated, they stick together really nice and tight. You can see like this. Okay. Now the dermis will be considered as vasculature. It has a blood supply, right? So that's called vascular. So it has blood vessel. We call it vessel. Now, there's another layer underneath, if you will, that has a lot of fat. So under, we will call this as hypodermis. Hypodermis. See, there you go. There's skin, it has 3 layers. You have the dermis, dermis here, and you have the epidermis above, and you have a layer underneath called hypodermis. That's dermis, no N. Okay? And the hypodermis, or sometimes they call it subcutaneous, if you will. This layer here is known as the cutaneous layer, and this right here is known as subcutaneous. Yes, layer, subcutaneous layer, and where this is right here, the integument system has two layers, the cutaneous and the subcutaneous layer. So in general, remember we're talking about epithelium here, only this layer of cell will divide. And this layers of cell, in order for divide, you got to get oxygens and nutrient. Where you going to get the oxygens and nutrient? From the blood supply here that is provided by the dermis. Now, layers of cells that stay up here are very far from the dermis, typically do not have enough oxygens and nutrients, so they will die. So a lot of time, these cells up here are died, they're flaking off, right? In fact, you can remove that layers of cells, and you can make your skin nice and pretty. It's called the exfoliation, if you will. Here's some of the function of the connective tissue. Establish the structural framework for the body. What kind of connective tissue is that? You guys know? In fact, you know what? I think you should know this one. There are three specialized connective tissue. There are three specialized connective tissue. So think of the radio station that you listen in the morning, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, the BBC, the British Broadcasting System. That's how I remember the specialized connective tissue. Okay. So the specialized connective tissues are the blood, bone, and cartilage. Exactly. It's good to know. Okay. So establishing the structural framework typically is your bone. Okay. Transporting fluid and dissolving material, that's your blood. Protecting delicate organs, certainly the cranium is made of bone, protected the brain, if you will. The rib cage, it's part of the skeletal system we're going to talk about next time, protects the lungs and the heart, for example. Supporting surrounding interconnected types of tissue. You can say this is like adipose tissue. They usually find around a lot, everywhere, adipose. And if you eat too much, all that carbohydrate, carbon source is converted to fat. And fat is everywhere in your body. Some people might have it, in the tummy area. There's usually a lot of that. Store of energy, of course, triglyceride, this is also fat. Connecting other types of tissue, again, tendons and ligament, and defending the body, invading microorganisms, that's part of the blood as well. Okay. Cartilage typically also is an area that you find between bones. Is made of cartilage, articulating cartilages that you see, but not ligament. Ligament is really connecting, is connective tissue, is bone to bone. Cartilage is the end of long bone made of cartilage, if you will, and it's a specialized connective tissue. The three major cells of the connective tissue are the fibroblasts. There are many. right? But you can see here there's many. There are fibroblasts, fibrocyte, adipocyte, mesenchymal stem cell, macrophage, lymphocyte, microphage like neutrophil, melanocyte, particularly in the skin, that created melanin. Okay, in fact, here you go. Another discussion on the integument system, and that is the melanocyte, um, is what you typically find uh, in the integument system that they're integrated within the epithelium and they make the skin color, if you will. The amount of melanocyte, it seems to be the same from person to person, but if the melanocyte produce more melanin, this pigment, then the person tends to be darker than the melanocyte doesn't produce a lot of melanin. Certainly, you can stimulate the melanocyte to produce melanin. How do you do that? Well, expose your body to the skin. Expose your body or the skin to the sunlight, if you will, UV light. Then you can stimulate the cells to produce it. So that's how people get tanning, is so that their body produces more melanin. Certainly, there are many cells here. I would say that you guys should focus on these three cells in the connective tissue. The macrophage, the watering, they're eating, if you will. The mast cells, they release histamine and heparin. But the major cells are the fibroblasts. And fibroblasts are the cells that produces the fiber, the collagen, if you will. So your skin has a lot of collagen that makes it bouncy, right? If you get older, you loses the collagen, then it's no longer bouncy. Your skin might get wrinkled, and then you can get a collagen injection, and it'll be nice and plump again. Okay, so fibers like collagen is often finds in the skin. Now, there certainly, we talk about specialized connective tissues of bone, blood, and cartilage. Connective tissue proper, there's loose or dense, right, or compact connective tissue. And the dense here will be tendon and ligament. And they're really hard to see because even if you stain them, you can't see them that well. And we usually don't test the student. They're kind of hard for them to distinguish. Elastic connective tissue, usually these types of tissue that has elastin that give it stretch. So your blood vessel, particularly artery, has a lot of elastin tissue. The lung has elastin tissue, stretch, inflate, deflate, elastic tissue. Adipose tissue is fat. The reticular connective tissue, I would say that, when we say this reticular connective tissue is, the key word here is to produce a mesh, okay, a mesh. So if you ever goes to a construction site, if you have an area that right before they put cement, they might lay down some wire, if you will, okay, to give you a mesh, like this. And when you pour the concrete, right, the concrete will bind to this to make it string, okay, and they stay together. Well, the reticular connective tissue oftentimes forms this network to give the structure of certain glands like the spleens or the spleen. Yeah, I guess you can say the thymus as well. That's a really good area to see this type. The spleen and the thymus. Okay. All right, let's move on. Adipose tissues typically is considered as fat. Uh, the cell is adipocyte. Now, and they'll find everywhere. The Sometimes the way that the histology work, is that we examine the tissue under the microscope, and if you want to see the nice structure integrity, typically you cut the sections about 5 micron thickness, the section. So 5 micron thickness. And that's very thin. You want it thin because you want light to be able to penetrate, pass through. And usually a lot of microscope underneath you have a light source. So then when you look down, the light that is going through the tissue, you can see it very nice. If light cannot pass through, then you can't see it. It's just basically a solid. And to cut that thin is really difficult. So oftentimes what you do is that you have a cube or a cassette that looks like this, a cassette, and you put your tissue here, and then you're going to pour wax, right? You might pour wax on it. Wax. Wax, the reason why you use wax is because you can heat up the wax to become liquid, and and then you just cool it down so it become a solid. Then it's able to cut it, right? This is known as paraffin, which is kind of like wax. So now you have the tissue, it's in a block of wax, and you just mount it in a microtome and you cut it, 5 micron thickness. But once you have that wax, you have to deparaffinize it, meaning that you remove the wax. So when you remove the wax using, xylene, that kind of thing, you remove the wax, you also remove the fat here as well. It's the same material. So adipocyte, oftentimes, you see here it's just a space, but remind you that when they're living, it is it's fat and they're round like fat, and all you see is just basically a cell wall, if you will. But all of this is fat, used to be fat, and that's why we call that a fat droplet inside. And you see membrane, the nucleus here. Okay, so that's adipose tissue. Loose areolar, good one to know. Loose connective tissue, a good example I keep telling you is areolar. And areolar is kind of like spider web. And you see them between muscle. Okay, you see here's muscle. And what you do is if you want to see, here, there's 4 muscle here in this area called the quadricep, right? The rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius, four muscle. But you can't really see them, the muscle fiber, very well. So what you got to do is you got to remove these spider webs slowly, right? You move that; those are all loose areolar connective tissue. Okay, between muscle, that's the key. Okay. All right, loose connective tissues like loose areolar, adipose tissue is one of them as well. Dense, we're talking about tendons already versus ligament. Tendon is muscle to bone, ligament is bone to bone. The connective tissue proper, again, there are many cells here, but I just focus on fibroblast, macrophage, and mast cell. And you can see here the breakdown of these cells. The mast cells release histamine and heparin. Histamine causes the blood vessel to open up. We call that vasodilation. And heparin is anticoagulant. The major connective tissue fibers are your collagen, okay, collagenous type, tendons and ligament, right? And remember, these tendons and ligament will be considered as a dense connective tissue, not loose, but dense. Connective tissue. Again, reticular fiber forms as that reticular type of connective tissue form a supported network, and that's what I mean by a mesh. Okay, and where do you see that? Again, in the thymus or the spleen. Elastic fibers, usually elastin stretch in the blood vessel, in the lung. You might see that elastic. The vocal cord, your larynx is where you have the vocal cord. That has elastic fibers so that it can vibrate. But I would say another area that has a lot of elastic fiber are arteries. And lungs. Since the lung inflate and deflate, in order to deflate or inflate, it has to have elastic fiber. The fibers are here. You can see collagen fiber, reticular fibers, and elastic fiber. Collagen fiber, collagen in general is a quaternary structure, okay, which means it has really three polypeptide that sort of like twist upon it, like, just like hemoglobin is a quaternary structure. Long, straight, unbranched, flexible, if you will, collagen. And it's that collagen that makes, your skin tight. It's bouncy. May have some hyaluronic acid too, right? What's her name made that commercial? Reticular fibers forms the network or the stroma sheets around organ. I would say that, again, two good examples where you might see this reticular fiber would be the spleen and thymus. Elastic fiber, if it's an elastic ligament, that would be the epiglottis, if you will, of the larynx. The larynx has 9 cartilages. Oh no, that's cartilage. Elastic ligament, or this is the vertebrae, okay, between the vertebrae. All right, sorry. And here it shows you the cells. You can see there are many cells, but focus on 3 major cells. The mast cell, which releases histamine and heparin, macrophage, which is involved in eating, and fibroblasts, which lay down the collagens. All these extra material are the fibroblasts. We're going to see later on the mesenchymal cells are really our stem cell, okay, that can give rise to a lot of they're derived from mesoderm layer. So all your bones and cartilage and stuff, come from this mesenchymal stem cell. Okay, they move around. All the other cells, connective tissue, adipose, the plasma cells is really part of the immune system, B lymphocyte. The melanocyte secrete the pigment, if you will. Maybe I would focus on that as well. Alrighty. The loose areolar, we saw already 3. The tight, loose connective tissue, areolar, adipose, and reticular. And you can see here, areolar finds, like spider, I told you, like a spider web, so that's good. Between muscle, okay? Between muscle. Here, between muscle. So circle that, between muscle. That's the loose areolar, oftentimes that you see. Adipose tissue, fat, you can find it everywhere. In fact, under the skin, under the dermis, is a layer known as hypodermis. It's also known as subcutaneous. Sometimes if you go to a clinic or a hospital where they give you an injection, one group of the injection is that they lift up your skin and they inject underneath. So we call that sub-Q for subcutaneous. Other times injection could be intramuscular. It goes to the muscle. Intravenous, right? You can do, intravenous injection. With increased risk of getting hepatitis C, HIV virus, and so forth. Also coronavirus. That's intravenous. So there's different types of injection. Subcutaneous is you lift up the skin. So we call that a sub-Q. And in the subcutaneous layer, there's a lot of adipose, a lot of fat there. Adipose tissue. They provide energy, if you will. In fact, there's different kinds of fat. Typically in adult, you see a lot of white fat. And white fat is areas to store carbon source. We say, okay, let's say you can break down fat to generate energy. So we'll say, okay, let's say it stores energy. Okay. The brown fat, however, is mainly is to provide breaks down of that fat to generate heat. Okay. And in hibernating animal, okay, hibernating animal, or even baby hibernating animal like bears and squirrel who sleeps during the winter, supposedly, they will have a lot of brown fat in neonate, newborn, because they're in children, neonate, their hypothalamus, which regulates the body temperature, hasn't worked very well. They might have a lot of brown fat, and breaks down of that of brown fat is to generate ATP and heat. Okay, and you will see a lot of brown fat. White fat is basically is an insulation, but it's you can store energy in that fat. In fact, if you take a gram of fat versus a gram of carbohydrate, a gram of fat would generate more ATP than a gram of carbohydrate. And so if you don't eat a lot and you work more in terms of calorie than you intake, the first thing you lose is probably all your glycogen. And once you use up your glycogen, you're going to use up your fat. And once you use up your fat, you start using up protein. Right? So you're going to lose muscle mass. Reticular tissue, epithelial spleen is a good one, right? Lymph node, but I would also say it's the thymus that you see as well. Okay. That forms this, they're sort of like loose, but they form a network, if you will. Okay. Dense connective tissue. The dense one we already talked about, which is again avascular. You can see here how dense it is. It's nice and compact. They're hard to see. Tendon, muscle to bone, ligament is between bone to bone. And in some cases, what we consider aponeurosis, which is usually on top, we call epicranial aponeurosis, or even the abdomen. Okay, you see this white tissue. That's dense regular connective tissue, aponeurosis. And the muscle is, some muscle attaches to bone, but some of them, they also attaches to connective tissue, like the aponeurosis, for example. Okay. All right. So good one for dense regular would be the tendons and ligament, and make sure you know the difference. Dense irregular connective tissue, these are usually find around cartilage, perichondrium, or around bone called periosteum. Okay, and we can talk more about the periosteum when we talk about the skeletal system. And, long bone development, long bone, typically you see this like this. Now, long bones develop from cartilage as a model first, and they get ossified into bone. But usually at the end of long bone, you see here, that remains as cartilage, and here too remain as cartilage. And long bone will have two regions. The region that is very thick, we call it the compact bone, and there's more trabeculae up here, we call that spongy bone up there. Okay. Spongy bone and then compact bone. And in the compact bone, that's where you might see osteon. And the osteon is the functional units of bone that you only see in the compact. Now, there's a tissue that is outside of this. This is known as the periosteum. Okay, periosteum. And that made out of a dense, irregular connective tissue. And inner lining is also is another layer is known as the endosteum. Okay, endosteum, that made out of endothelial layer, endothelial layer, not the periosteum outside, which is made of the dense, irregular connective tissue. Elastic tissues, in this case called intervertebral disc. Okay. It has tissues in there, makes it elastic. But elastin is finds it everywhere. Liver, spleen, lymphatic organ, like the thymus, if you will have these reticular fiber. Dense connective tissue, again, poor blood supplies, avascular, ligament and tendon. Good example of dense connective. Elastic connective tissues, artery, lungs, and in heart to some extent, so that it allows us to stretch and to come back. But a two good area is the lung and the blood vessel, like artery. All right, specialized connective tissue. This would be your blood. Now, blood is interesting. It finds in the middle of the long bone. And we can talk about more blood when talking about skeletal system. But remember, blood is a suspension. Okay, and that there are particles in the blood that it's just floating, if you will. So if you take the blood and you let it outside for a while, it'll settle down. So that's a general definition of a suspension. Particles are suspended as opposed to dissolve. Okay, suspension. Now, blood has your red blood cell, white blood cell, you know, platelets. In 302, you're going to study a lot on blood, as well as proteins. It carries oxygens and nutrients and so forth, and heat and so forth, right? So blood is a very important component. To a lot of students just think blood is red blood cell. No, blood has red blood cell, white blood cells, part of the immune system, platelets which help your blood to coagulate if you have a cut, proteins which like albumin play important role in osmotic pressure to draw fluid back into the blood vessel. And the blood typically travel in arteries and veins. Arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Most of the time, it's carry oxygenated blood, and veins will carry blood toward the heart, and it typically is carry deoxygenated blood. See blood here, you can see that platelet, white blood cell, red blood cells. White blood cells play an important role in the immune system. Platelets for clotting. Okay. You can see the blood inside the heart. In fact, the heart function is to pump blood and to provide that oxygen and nutrients. I'm not going to talk about too much, but this is red blood cell, also known as erythrocyte. They don't have nucleus, they're anucleus. If you take 1 microliters of blood, you have about 5 million red blood cells. Okay, so good number to know. 1 microliter, that's a microliter of blood. You have about 5 times 10 to the 6 RBC, or red blood cell. Okay? And they don't have a nucleus. They had a nucleus, but they mature red blood cell, when they leaves the bone marrow, they loses the nucleus. The nucleus disintegrates. They carry oxygen, so oxygenated blood is known as oxygenated. Hemoglobin has carried oxygenated blood, and deoxygenated blood means it has more CO2 in the blood than oxygen. White blood cells, including monocyte and lymphocyte, these cells don't have granules, so you can call them agranules, whereas these have granules, so you can call these a granulocyte, and these can be considered agranulocyte. A granulocyte, okay, no granule, and these is considered as granulocyte. Granulocyte. And typically, if you have 1 microliters of blood, you have about 5 to 10,000 of these white blood cells. So 1 microliter of blood you have between 5,000 to 10,000 white blood cells. Now you have something that is smaller. These typically say, here's your red blood cell, here's your red blood cell, here's your red blood cell, biconcave disc. Okay, this is RBC. White blood cells, they tend to be bigger. White blood cell. Okay, if there's granulocyte, granules in them, these are white blood cells. They're bigger. Right. See, and if this fragment of these gigantic cells that you see in the nucleus, called megakaryocyte, they're much smaller than the red blood cell here. These are platelets. Okay, or they're also known as thrombocyte. And you have for 1 microliter, 1 microliter of blood, you have between 200,000 to 400,000 platelets. Okay? And you can see, here's a good example. Okay. Now you see here, all of these right here is red blood cell. And this white blood cell is much bigger. And the little dot right there, there's a little small, here's another one, dot. Those are platelets. Here's another one, platelets. They're much smaller. Here's one over there, platelets. Red blood cell, white blood cell, platelet, and platelets play an important role in blood coagulation, clotting, if you will. Lymph, so typically lymph come from interstitial fluid, and just like blood travel in blood vessel, lymph is the fluid that flow in lymphatic vessel. Just as blood is travel in the blood vessel, lymph flows in the lymphatic vessel. It's another type of vessel, okay? Not blood vessel, but lymph vessel. And all that lymph vessel does is that it carries interstitial fluid. That means the fluids between the cells. Sometimes lymphocyte, travel in the lymphatic vessel with the lymph. Okay, so that's blood. The next type of specialized connective tissue is cartilage. And there are, 3 different kinds of cartilages, if you will. One is known as hyaline type of cartilage, right here. And this is the most abundant. Typically, you find them at the end of long bone, right? It's hyaline type, or in the rib cage, if you will. It's hyaline, and the word hyaline means glass-like. Glass-like. It's opaque. It's glass-like. Fibrocartilage is the strongest. Okay? It's the strongest type, and they're usually found at the pubis. They're found between the vertebrae, if you will, intervertebral disc, if you will, because it has to withstand all that weight on it. Okay, intervertebral disc, you can see there, and they're part of the pubis symphysis, is where the two pubic bone called the oscosine meet, right? This is known as the pubis symphysis. And that's a really good area to give you an example of the fibrocartilage. Okay. Intervertebral disc, and that's the pubic symphysis. Pubic is one of the bone. Symphysis is where they comes together. Okay. The elastic type of cartilage, that's easy. That's like your ear, you see here. The epiglottis of the larynx is one type. I would say that. The larynx have 9 cartilages, but one of them is known as the epiglottis. Okay. The epiglottis. All right. Now, cartilage stay in a little lake known as lacunae, and in there you might see 2 cells that looks like this, and these are known as chondrocyte. Chondrocyte. So when you ever see chondrocyte that looks like that, there's a special stain for that too that kind of looks like purplish, sometimes bluish. You know that's cartilage. And if you have a tissue that has pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and underneath you have cartilage, most likely is your trachea will have that. Okay, here. All right, so cartilage, you can see there. Chondrocyte is the cells that make the cartilage. They stays in that little lacunae or chambers, and in the case of next time we'll talk about the skeletal system and how the skeletal system of long bone, typically bones that's from the neck down, is made by this process known as endochondral ossification. And they start out with cartilage base first, and then they get calcified. And around this cartilage, there, the edge, also made out of that irregular, dense connective tissue. This is known as the perichondrium. Okay, it's the outer layer. And cartilage also have no blood vessel. Okay, here are 3 types of cartilages. You can see here, that's a beautiful chondrocyte within the lacunae. Okay, that's tell you. And here it shows you, this is a hyaline type. You usually see at the end of long bone. Okay. At the end of long bone. Or here in the rib cage, as you can see. Okay. And I would say, let's say here's long bone. This area here is cartilage. You know, like you ever eat chicken, right? You eat through and you see this white part at the end, that's cartilage. And long bone is made by this process known as endogroup. So long bones are made by the process known as endochondral ossification. Okay, and look at the name. Endo mean inside, chondro mean cartilage. So in other words, in the fetal skeleton, this is cartilage, and then it gets calcified to bone. Except at the end, it has not been calcified, so it remains as cartilage. Okay. The elastic type, good example is the pinna of the ear, and it's just cartilage with elastic fiber that makes it give you elastic. Fibrocartilage is the strongest one that you've found here at the intervertebral disc. It's also at the pubis symphysis as well. Okay. Hyaline cartilage, lacunae. Here's a long bone, and you can see here articulating cartilage, articulating where they meet. This is a humerus. Articulating cartilage here of the humerus is articulate with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. This is part of the one of the joint freely moving. We call this diatosis, and there's synovial fluid because there's a lot of fluid in here as well. Hyaline type, the most abundant. Okay. Elastic type, pinna of the ear. Sometimes you see it in the nose as well because you can, deform it. And the epiglottis of the ear. Epiglottis of the word glottis means opening. Epi means above. So it's one of the 9 cartilages of the larynx. And in fact, the larynx is produced in this void box. But the larynx is also an area that could produces coughing, if you will. You know how you cough like that? And the way that you do that is you close down on the epiglottis and you generate all that pressure, right? By squeezing your abdominal muscle, right? And press your rib cage down. So you get all that pressure, they're ready to bust. And all you do is you open up the epiglottis and all that air comes out. That's how you cough. Fibrocartilage strongest, between pubic bone, pubic symphysis, and intervertebral disc. It's a good example. All right, and then thirdly, the specialized connective tissue we're going to talk about a lot. We'll talk about bone. Bone here that you see, like the humerus, it's an organ. It has multiple tissue, but bone certainly has bone tissue. But it also has neural tissue too, because if you break your bone, you'll feel pain. But bone as a bone tissue, it has a hydroxyapatite, it's calcified material, if you will. Now, there are different kinds of cells that you need to know to distinguish. Okay. Now, like the lacunae in chondrus, the chondrocyte lacunae is found in the cartilage, right? And oftentimes you see them as 2 cartilage. And this is lacunae. In bone, you also have a lacunae, but the cell that you see here are osteocyte. Osteocyte. Now, the osteocyte are mature osteoblasts. And osteoblasts come from mesenchymal stem cells. And osteoblasts make the bone matrix. Okay, they make the bone matrix. They make the bones matrix. Okay. And once they make the bones matrix, they get trapped, so they become osteocyte in here. So initially they might be, just like here, and they put a lot of matrix, right? And it's like you paint yourselves in a corner, if you will. So then they get trapped, so they become osteocyte. But this is different from this cell, it's known as the osteoclast. Osteoclast is the opposite of osteocyte because this cell chew up bone. Okay, they chew up bone. So chew up bone in a way you can think of it as to release calcium because bone is calcified, right? So chew bone, chew up bone. So osteoblasts are the cells that take calcium and put it in bone. So you can say they're participating in reducing the blood calcium level, whereas osteoclasts are involved in increasing your blood calcium level. Okay. Now, it doesn't seem like I will have a lot of time to go into the integument system, but maybe 4 questions then, or 3 questions on the integument system. We talk about the dermis, and then above that, the epidermis, and we talk about below that, the hypodermis. We talk about gland that you find associated with the skin, and the layers that you see, in the epidermis, the stratum, corneum, and so forth. So those are you have to remember. So that's really those things. And I will put that in a review sheet, so make sure that you know that. So I guess I will post the review sheet. Okay. The bones, so this is part of the compact bone, okay? And we're going to look at the way that compact bone is made is by this lamella plate that is laying down, crisscross pattern, right? So there's lamella plate. So you have the central canal, which is this right here. And the lamella plate is putting around the central canal like this, around it. And they're in crisscross pattern, right? Plate. In the compact bone that you see here, a good word to know is an osteon. You see here, that's an osteon. You define an osteon as a functional unit of bone. I like to use sometimes words like functional unit. Functional unit of bone. Okay, that's an osteon. And you can see this, typically there's a central canal, you see there, and there's lacunae. Inside the lacunae is your osteocyte, and they might connect to each other via a little canal called canaliculi. Next time we'll look at the bone in general. You find that different kinds of lamella plate. If it's involved in osteon, it's more like concentric. If it's more like on the outside, it's circumferential. And if it's more like between here, it considers interstitial lamella plate. You don't need to know that for exam 2, but in exam 3, you would need to know that. All right, so in 8 minutes or so, we're going to talk about muscle, and there are 3 kinds of muscle. You have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And muscle in general is involving contraction. Cardiac defines in the heart. Smooth is the only one that it can divide, by the way. Cardiac and skeletal muscle cannot divide, but smooth muscle can. Histologically, you can tell them different is that skeletal muscle and cardiac have striation. Okay? What is striation? You see this pattern here? Dark black, dark black, dark black, dark black. That is striation. Okay? Skeletal muscle are the muscle that finds attached to the skeleton, if you will. They have multinuclei, and they usually sit on the edge, called the periphery. Okay? Now, physiologically, you can say skeletal muscle is the only one that you can tell it when to contract. So we call that as voluntary. Okay. Voluntary. Tell it when to contract. Okay. That's physiologically. Cardiac muscle, very similar to skeletal muscle in that it has striation. But another interesting thing is branch, is split. Right? Here's a cardiac muscle that's split. You do not see that in skeletal. Furthermore, the nucleus tend to be in the center. In cardiac muscle, when one part of the heart contract, all of them, the cell must contract at the same time. In order to work as a unit, it has gap junction. And the gap junction is very evident in intercalating discs. Okay, intercalating disc where you see gap junction. All right, cardiac, smooth muscle, the only one that then divide, they tend to be taper at the end, like this. Not striation, and you cannot tell it when to contract either. It's the only one that can divide and regenerate. Okay. So a good example of that is the uterus. So the female uterus, for example, when she carry a child or fetus, the uterus will get really big, and then when she gives birth, it can go down as well. All right, here's summarized as the skeletal muscle striation, multinuclei. The nucleus pushes to the side. Voluntary in terms of contraction. Smooth muscle, involuntary. Typically find like most of the visceral organ is smooth muscle. And cardiac is in the heart. Must work together as a unit. As gap junction at these intercalating discs. A muscle tends to be branched, has striation like skeletal muscle, but this is involuntary. The cardiac has, we call it self-excitatory. I mean, it can generate an electrical impulse that causes it to contract by itself. All right, so the major cells of the nervous tissues are the neurons, you can see here, and neuron has many extensions, but there's only one big one called the axon and many dendrites. And there are supporting cells known as neuroglial cells. And remember, nervous tissue, we're going to talk about a lot of this, but think of them, they're involving three major functions: sensory, integration, and motor function. Okay? Sensory, integration, and motor function. Motor function means that the nervous system innervates the effector to do something. Neural tissue here, the central nervous system are the brains and the spinal cord, and then you have extension from that called the peripheral nervous system. The major cells are here, the neurons, and the supporting cell, also known as the neuroglial cell. Neuron have three major: the cell body, also known as the soma, and the dendrite tend to carry the electrical impulse toward the soma. So there's a dendrite. And then the major one is axon, which carries the electrical impulse away from the soma. Okay? All right. Here's your typical axon. You can see here is the axon. Here's are the dendrites. And we were talking about more different kinds of neuron. Is it unipolar, bipolar, multipolar? Is the neuron carrying sensory information, or if it's involved in sensory, bringing the information in, or is it, innervating effector? So we call that a motor neuron, if you will. Um, let's. I'm just going to stop it there. Are there any questions? Different kinds of membrane. I'm not going to test you different kinds of membrane. Um, so let's say end it there, and they're going to be. Oh yeah, maybe one more. I'm sorry, one more. I have one more minute, and this is different types of membrane. And there are 4 different types. Serous membrane is a type that usually lining some kind of cavity. We saw that serous membrane around the thoracic cavity surrounding the lung, for example, is known as the pleural membrane. Is surrounding the heart is pericardial, and in the abdomen is known as the peritoneum. We saw the mucous membrane that has the goblet cells, usually respiratory tract has a mucous membrane. Cutaneous membrane, the skin. Cutaneous layer is the dermis and the epidermis, and the layer underneath called subcutaneous. And synovial membrane is part of that joint, if you will. That has a fluids in between. So synovial fluid is often found in synovial membrane, synovial joints that makes it, lubricates it so that it can move freely. Sometimes, people have leaky fluid, and it could have a joint problem known as arthritis. All right, I'm just going to end it there. I'm going to stop the recording here, and so your exam will be up to the